Everyone knows that Peppa Pig is one of the most beloved and well-known children's shows in the world, with fans everywhere. But what not everyone might know is that there's a dark and surprising secret hidden behind one of the show's most enigmatic characters, Madame Gazelle. Get ready, because today we're going to uncover a mystery that few have noticed, but that could completely change how you view this character. We're going to show you that there is strong evidence that Madame Gazelle might actually be an immortal being. Let's start with one of the most intriguing details we found about Peppa's teacher. Apparently, even immortal beings celebrate Christmas. At least, that's the impression we get when we look at one of the show's most revealing episodes, Madame Gazelle's house. When Peppa and her family visit their teacher's house, Madame Gazelle mentions that the house has been showing signs of wear and tear for so long that she can't even remember when it all started. The house is old, of course, but what really catches our attention is the gigantic Christmas tree that has grown beside it, towering as high as a 4-story building. And how do we know this? Madame Gazelle reveals that she herself planted this tree when it was just a small sapling. Now think about it. How long does it take for a Christmas tree to reach 12 meters, which corresponds to a 4-story building? Being curious, we did some research, and believe it or not, we found out that this can take about 40 long years. In other words, between the time Madame Gazelle planted that tiny Christmas tree and the day Peppa's family visited her house, 4 entire decades or more had passed. And what's even more impressive is that back then, Madame Gazelle was already an adult. This becomes even clearer when we see a picture of her husband on the wall, both in the past and present, indicating that she has been a widow for a long time. This leads us to think, how could someone have planted a tree that grew so much and yet still seems so young? The answer might be simple. Madame Gazelle is actually an immortal creature, like a vampire, who remains the same for centuries. The coolest part is that in the same episode, there are even more clues to support this theory. When Mr. Bull mentions that there are bats in the tree, Madame Gazelle comments that they remind her of her homeland. Now, think with me. Is there a country full of bats and known for that? The only place that comes to mind when thinking about this would be the legendary Transylvania, the setting of the most famous vampire tale in history, Count Dracula. Another curious and sinister detail that makes us believe Madame Gazelle has a much darker origin than it seems is related to her nighttime habits. In a rather revealing episode, Peppa volunteers to take care of Madame Gazelle's guinea pigs while the teacher goes on vacation. The little creatures, Ginger and Brian, are left in Peppa's care, while Madame Gazelle goes, perhaps, to visit her homeland, which we mentioned earlier. Before leaving, Madame Gazelle hands Peppa and her parents a care list, and among the various instructions, one stands out. She insists that the guinea pigs need to be brushed several times, including a session in the middle of the night. Now, let's think, who would wake up in the middle of the night just to brush guinea pigs? No one, unless you're a creature who is naturally awake at that time, like a vampire who thrives at night. This would perfectly explain why Madame Gazelle included such a peculiar detail on her list. And if we look closely, we could even say that the reason Madame Gazelle wears blue eyeshadow is to hide the dark circles of someone who never sleeps. After all, sleeping isn't in a vampire's nature, and this would explain why she carries out her nighttime tasks so naturally. For her, it's completely normal to be active at night. If you also think Madame Gazelle is much more than just a simple teacher, comment below immortal. Now, let's talk about Madame Gazelle's age. There is something very strange and mysterious about how long she has actually lived. In the episode where everyone gathers to say goodbye to the teacher, thinking she's leaving forever, Daddy Pig reveals that Madame Gazelle was also his and Mummy Pig's teacher. This gives us a clue that Madame Gazelle might be much older than she appears. And that's not all. Despite appearing older than some of the other adult characters, Madame Gazelle doesn't have the same aged look we see, for example, in Grandpa Pig or Grandpa Dog, whose white hair and beards clearly show their advanced age. Instead, Madame Gazelle looks almost identical to the version that taught Peppa's parents so many years ago. This would only be possible if she were, in fact, a vampire, because vampires don't age. They remain looking the same for eternity. This detail could lead us to think that Madame Gazelle has been around for a very, very long time, and that her youthful appearance is just a disguise to hide her true immortal nature. But this isn't the only clue that she might be an ancient ancient creature. In the Halloween special episode, for example, we see even more evidence that she is much more than just a simple teacher. One of the scariest moments that reinforce the theory that Madame Gazelle is an immortal vampire happens in the Halloween special called Madame Gazelle Had a Castle. In this episode, Peppa plays with Madame Gazelle, and at one point, we see a mirror in the background. However, if you look closely, you'll notice that only Peppa's reflection is visible in the mirror, as if the little pig were completely alone, even though Madame Gazelle is standing right in front of her. Peppa herself is startled when she realizes that only she has a reflection, while Madame Gazelle looks directly at her through the mirror, seemingly unconcerned that her reflection doesn't appear. This is something that aligns perfectly with vampire mythology, where vampires are known not to have reflections, as, according to legends, they lack a soul. So, could it be that the protagonist school teacher is a being completely devoid of a soul? Honestly, that seems quite likely. And this isn't the only time it happens, because in the Halloween special episode of the Pink Pig series, we again see Madame Gazelle without a reflection in a mirror, in the scene where Susie, Peppa's best friend, shows off her vampire costume to the teacher. Just like in the scene we talked about earlier, we see that only Susie appears in the mirror, while Madame Gazelle once again has no reflection. This only reinforces the theory that she is, indeed, a vampire. Moreover, when Susie mentions that she's having fun pretending to be a vampire, Madame Gazelle sighs and says those words bring back many memories of her homeland.
Ah, a vampire! That brings back memories of the old country.
But what kind of homeland would evoke memories of vampires? The only possible answer is Transylvania, the land of the legendary Dracula. And we can't forget the fact that she really doesn't appear in the mirror, which without a doubt wasn't an animation mistake, but something intentionally included in the episode to reinforce the theory that Madame Gazelle is, in fact, a vampire. Now let's talk about some physical traits that also suggest Madame Gazelle might not be exactly what she appears to be. In one episode, we see the character playing with the children during recess, and while playing, she hits a ball so hard that it cracks the school roof. Now, think about it. Is it normal for a lady who is supposedly elderly to have that kind of strength? Of course not, unless she's a vampire with superhuman strength. Moreover, in the episode Beach and Snow, Madame Gazelle surprises everyone when she decides to go to the beach with the other moms on a day when the snow is so high it covers Daddy Pig. This would already be strange enough, but what comes next is even more bizarre. She suggests everyone go into the sea, even with snow all around, because the water isn't frozen. Then she dives into the cold water, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, even commenting that the water is wonderful. Now, let's be realistic. No ordinary person would withstand that temperature without feeling extreme discomfort. Mummy Pig even tries, but quickly leaves the water. It was so cold. Meanwhile, Madame Gazelle remains calmly in the cold water, as if it were normal for her. This leads us to believe that she might actually be a vampire, a creature naturally cold-blooded that can survive extreme conditions without any problems. If you've made it this far, it's because you love cartoons as much as I do. So go ahead and click the subscribe button right now before you forget. Based on everything we've seen so far, we can safely say that Madame Gazelle is a completely different character from the others in Peppa Pig. There aren't just one or two clues, but many that suggest she possesses powers and traits that go far beyond what we see in the other characters. And the most curious thing is that this might have been done intentionally by the show's creators. All the characters in Peppa Pig are inspired by real animals, like bulls, rhinos, rabbits, and even elephants. But few people know that there is a real creature called the vampire gazelle. It's a type of deer that has huge canine teeth that stand out on its face, despite not having antlers, like Madame Gazelle. Despite its scary appearance, this creature poses no danger to anyone. So, it's quite possible that the creators of Peppa Pig were inspired by this creature to create the character of Madame Gazelle, because although she is probably a vampire, she's a good teacher and doesn't seem to have any evil intentions. On the contrary, she is caring, attentive, and looks out for her students. She might be a vampire, but she's a good vampire who takes care of her responsibilities and does the best for her students. For all these reasons, Madame Gazelle is perfect for representing someone with mystical powers, such as not having a reflection in the mirror, hitting balls with absurd force, or even enduring the icy waters of a snow-covered sea. All these things, while eerie, don't harm anyone, but only prove that Madame Gazelle is a different kind of creature living among us, disguised as a simple school teacher. If you enjoyed discovering or confirming this, share this video with your family and friends, and click like so we know you enjoyed it.